Hello and welcome to Cultivate. I'm your host, Genifer Murray, and I'm pleased to introduce Patrick Gray, who is a PhD and CEO, president of Pascal Biosciences. Dr. Gray, welcome to Cultivate.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. I'm happy to be here today.
And Dr. Gray, you're actually in Seattle, correct?
That's correct.
Very good. All right, well, tell us a little bit about yourself and, how come cannabis? How'd you get into cannabis?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've been in the biotech industry for 38 years now. Started in 1980. Before that, I got my PhD down the road from you at the University of Colorado. And been focused on chemistry and biology and molecular biology, and that led me into the pharmaceutical world. I have always been interested in small biotech companies. I worked at Genentech when it was a little company to begin with. It's now a giant company, and they certainly do great work. But I've always liked small companies, and after Genentech, I worked in academia for a little bit, and then I moved to the Northwest where I grew up, and I worked at a couple of companies here. Pascal really interested me because of the science that they had, and I've always been interested in developing products for cancer. So one of the programs that we got from the University of British Columbia when the company was started was looking for modulators that would improve the immune system and the ability of the immune system to fight cancer. So we had a screen to look for natural products that would actually do that. And we discovered that the best compound that did that came from cannabis. And so that's how we really got into the world of cannabis and cannabinoids. And since we discovered that about 2 years ago, we first reported it now right about a year ago, but we first made our initial discovery about 2 years ago. And we confirmed it in mouse and human cells and in animals. And we've looked at 400 different cannabinoids to try to find the best ones that are really good at stimulating the immune system. And so that's how we really got into the cannabinoid world.
So a couple of questions.
Sure.
You said that you tried some other compounds and then cannabis. How far was cannabis down the line?
Well, our scientific founder had worked with a natural product library out of marine organisms.
Okay.
He had spent about 10 years looking at thousands of compounds from these isolated marine organisms. And some of them worked in his assay pretty well, but when I sat down with him, with a chemist friend of mine, and we looked at the structures, we thought maybe we could do better. And so we ordered up 30 other compounds. Only one of them was a cannabinoid, and it had about 10 times better activity than anything he had ever seen.
Wow.
And so based on that, we started looking at more and more cannabinoids, and that led us to the 400 that we've already done today.
Yeah, and that was my next question. I know that when I started in 2010, the number was over 66 cannabinoids. And as the years go by, I thought it was 140, and now you're telling me over 400. This plant is so amazing, and that's, of course, why we need all these studies.
Yeah, exactly. So just to be clear, we've looked at endogenous cannabinoids. We've looked at cannabinoids from the plant, and then we've also looked at synthetic compounds. So a lot of our compounds are synthetic, but we've also looked at a bunch of natural compounds from cannabis.
Okay, so we will definitely address synthetic versus coming from the plant, and get your opinion on that. But
Sure.
let's dive in. In 2008, Pascal made a significant announcement relating to cannabinoids and immunotherapy for cancer. Can you talk more about this?
Yeah, so 2018, we described work, kind of what I've gone over, but with a little bit more extension to it. And that is that we made this initial discovery that cannabinoids can enhance the immune system. And since then, we have done a bunch of efforts to both confirm that with different compounds in both mice and humans, but also we've extended the immunological studies that we've begun. And so we have looked at several different assays in cultured cells, but also in mice that have tumors. And we've been able to show that when we treat those mice with cannabinoids, we get a nice immune response. And we believe that this is going to be really helpful when we actually go into human patients.
Got it. And I forgot to ask you this earlier. Why cancer?
Well, there's a number of reasons. I think the main one really is that there's an unmet need. And cannabis has a history in treatment of cancer patients, not specifically to try to eliminate the cancer, but to help with some of the cancer symptoms. So the nausea that is caused by chemotherapeutic drugs is often very well treated with cannabinoids. Some patients never feel like they want to eat when they're getting chemotherapy or when the cancer is very far along. And so THC really is pretty helpful for that. So it helps induce eating. And then of course the anxiety that comes along with having cancer is a very big deal that cannabinoids can be very helpful with.
Absolutely. They can change your whole mindset, and of course, mind body. So
exactly.
One of these programs deals with a type of cancer called glioblastoma. Can you talk a little bit about that trial and what that disease is?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Glioblastoma is one of the most severe types of cancer. It's a brain cancer that affects of all the types of brain cancer, glioblastoma represents about 15%. And that's about 15,000 patients also in North America. But it's a very deadly form of brain cancer. All forms of brain cancer aren't very good, but most of it is caused by metastatic cancer from other organs. The prognosis for glioblastoma is very dire. The average patient lives about 14 months after diagnosis, and the treatment is very limited. So the patients typically get surgery, and if it's possible to have surgery, the patients will have surgery. Sometimes the tumor's in a part of the brain where that's not possible. They also typically get radiation, and then there's one drug that kind of works. It has an efficacy for it. It only extends life by 2.5 months. That drug's called temozolomide, and it's an old-style drug that's a class called DNA alkylators. And these are some of the first anti-cancer drugs that were ever discovered and developed and used.
Long time ago then, right?
Yeah, I mean, these really go back to the 1950s. And unfortunately, almost no chemotherapeutics get into the brain. So the blood-brain barrier is really set up to prevent a lot of compounds from getting into the brain. And temozolomide is really the only chemotherapeutic that can do that. Now, the other part of it is that the other part of it is that chemotherapeutics do work quite well when they're used in combination with other drugs. And so if you have drugs that have multiple mechanisms of action, then they can work together to synergize and kill tumors. But in glioblastoma, unfortunately, there's only one drug. And so the one that we're developing has a totally different mechanism of action than temozolomide, and therefore it should work together to really kill the tumor. So we're really enthusiastic about this program, and we really think it's got a lot of potential to help patients with brain cancer.
Well, that's fascinating. And the reason cannabis is helping, right, is because it does cross the blood-brain barrier.
Most of the cannabinoids cross the blood-brain barrier. And the other thing that's really good about the vast majority of cannabinoids, especially the phytocannabinoids, the natural ones, is that they have a very good safety profile. So they've been used for years and years, and the safety profile is very well characterized. And this is recognized by doctors and the FDA too.
Okay, well, speaking of the FDA and the DEA, of course, cannabis is a Schedule I drug, right? So the United States really hasn't studied it because it doesn't have any medicinal benefits. So can you describe this, and is it because you're teamed up? Well, I'll let you talk about that, about the university.
Okay. Yeah, you're exactly right. The rules for treating patients with cannabis have been archaic for decades and decades. And because of that, really good clinical studies haven't been done, which is unfortunate because, people haven't really understood the potential benefits. I think epilepsy is a really good example of this. The initial studies that suggested that CBD and cannabis might be helpful for epilepsy go back to the 1970s. And yet the first drug that got approved was about 6 months ago when GW Pharma had their CBD approved, and it works spectacularly. And so it's just taken so long to get investigators over this feeling that cannabis may or may not have unique activities, and then the government rules for actually using them in both clinical trials or in academic studies. So it's always been difficult to use a characterized source of cannabis or cannabinoids. It's been difficult to work either in companies or in academia because of the strict laws that are required. So more than a year ago, we decided we'd better get a license from the DEA to do this. At the same time, we applied for one in Canada, where our scientific founder is. And Health Canada has very similar rules and a very similar rigorous protocol to get approval. And so we went through that whole process, and it took about 10 months to get approval from the DEA here in Seattle. And and finally we got it. And so we've been able to work with these Schedule I compounds.
That was another question I had, is when you do clinical trials in Canada and when you do clinical trials in the US, they don't automatically adopt each other. Does the US have to do you have to do the clinical trials then again in the US and then again in Canada?
No, in most of the developed countries throughout the world, each country has its own regulatory agency that oversees clinical trials and approval of drugs. And there's a lot of collaboration between agencies of different countries. And so when the FDA gives approval for a drug, then it's not immediately recognized, but all of the efforts that you have to do, all of the clinical trials and characterization that needs to be done to get FDA approval is recognized by other countries. And so you just have to go through their specific process. But the data that you've created is going to work in all countries. In Europe, it's an interesting system. It's called the EMA, the European Medical Authority, I think, and it's a separate process, but it's very similar to the FDA.
Got it. Okay, I've always wondered that. Okay, so let's talk about what you guys are working on. It's called ST403. And from what I read, it's 300 times more powerful than THC. So let's talk about you starting with THC and then how you derived it into this ST403.
So, yeah, this actually goes back to a scientific publication in 2000. And in that publication, it mentioned that cannabinoids can kill cells, glioblastoma cells from patients. And they tested THC, they tested CBD, and they even did a study in rodents to kind of confirm this. However, the amounts of drug that are required, particularly for THC, were pretty high. They're not the kind of levels you would want to take as a patient. They would be overly debilitating. And in addition, those compounds really have a different mechanism for killing glioblastoma cells. So it's not the well-characterized receptors for cannabinoids, the cannabinoid receptor 1 and 2, CB1 and CB2. Those are the receptors that are found both in the brain that give the psychotropic effects and in the immune system. And our scientific collaborator at the University of Washington, his name is Nefi Stella, he learned pretty early on that the glioblastoma cells were dying whether or not they had those receptors. And so he looked to see what the mechanism was. And that was a long road. It was also a long road doing the chemistry, coming up with better and better compounds. So that's been about a 15-year process to develop the compound to where it's very potent and the mechanism of action is well characterized. So yeah, all that effort took a long time, and the compound that we ended up with, we call it cannabinoid based because it does still interact weakly with the CB1 and CB2 receptors, but it's very good at killing glioblastoma cells.
And are we talking about synthetic?
Yeah, so this is a synthetic cannabinoid, and it's really evolved away from THC and CBD quite a bit. It's still a small molecule with the sort of typical ring structure that you would see in a cannabinoid, but it's really evolved a lot from that to specifically work on glioblastoma cells with our characterized mechanism of action.
Okay, so let's get into the synthetic talk. I'm sure
Sure.
that you understand that the industry has a huge backlash to pharma and to synthetics because we saw Marinol, synthetic THC, that has killed people, and of course the plan has never been led to any deaths. Why synthetic? And it seems that with synthetic drugs that you do have more side effects versus the whole plant. Is that correct? And can you talk about that?
Yeah, I think that's generally true because the natural cannabinoids that come from the plant have been used for eons, and there's a known safety profile with them. Whereas if you take a synthetic compound and you modify it, you never really know how it's going to behave. It has to be tested in animals, and you go through a whole protocol to develop a safety understanding of that compound. And when you finally go into patients, then you just incrementally increase the dose from a very small level up to higher levels that you know are not toxic. When you talk about cancer, the thing is that you want to develop a toxic compound. At least you want it to be toxic to the tumor cells. Hopefully it will be less toxic to normal cells, but that's always the goal, is to come up with a tumor-specific compound and limit the amount of damage to normal tissues.
Got it. So since it is estimated 300 times more than THC, so does it still give you those psychotropic effects? And is that one reason why you may want to to get away from THC, because you do need it so much stronger? I don't know if I'm making sense, but
no, that's fine. You are. Yeah. So one of the advantages we mentioned earlier is that cannabinoids cross the blood-brain barrier. They get into the brain, and that's how THC gets its psychotropic effects. So that's one of the first advantages of working with cannabinoids, is they're going to get into the brain. Our compound doesn't hit the same receptors with anywhere near the potency of THC. So our compound is not going to have psychotropic effects. It's probably at least 1,000-fold less potent in the psychotropic arena. So it's just not going to work on the CB1 receptor nearly as well as THC will. So we won't see the psychotropic effects. We should see the killing of glioblastoma cells. So that's what we want to do.
okay, so when we talk about 300 times more powerful this is than THC, and then we talk about how it, not a lot of it, it's less, okay, wait.
Yeah, it's more powerful in killing glioblastoma cells. It's
Okay.
less powerful in the psychotropic activity.
That's exactly what I was trying to say. Okay, and then have you seen some side effects so far?
Well, we haven't got it in patients yet. So at the end of this year, our goal is to start treating patients in a phase 1 clinical trial. And that's where we'll see any kind of bad side effects. as we increase the dose. And so at this point, we don't quite know that. We're in the process of doing extensive animal testing, and I can tell you at this point, the compound is relatively safe. So we have been able to put the compound in mice with tumors, and there's been a nice effect on the glioblastoma cells, but no real toxic effect overall on the mice.
That's incredible. That's really incredible. So let's talk about some key upcoming milestones for your company.
Sure.
Where are you at in the clinical trial program? And kind of how does that work? And, closing on that, and then, putting out some, I guess, white papers.
Yeah, so there's a very well-clarified process to get a drug into clinical trials, and we're well on the way of doing that. So we have our manufacturing efforts ongoing, and that process is going very well. It's a relatively simple molecule and a relatively simple manufacturing process. There are the animal studies I mentioned. There's all sorts of sort of safety efforts that you test the compound just to make sure that it's going to really focus on your target and not have detrimental off-target activities. So all of that effort is underway. We then go to the FDA. First, we have what's called a pre-IND meeting. The IND is investigational new drug. So that meeting will occur probably this summer, and we'll get advice from the FDA to find out that we're on track and making sure that we're headed in the right direction. And then in November, we hope to actually file the investigational new drug application. So that's a big deal for a young company like ours, and we're certainly well on the way of doing that. The FDA will look at that application, they'll review it within 30 days, and if they don't have any significant issues, then you can start treating patients. So those are really the milestones for our glioblastoma program. We also have a program on cannabinoids and cancer. And this is really using natural cannabinoids, where we have shown that they can enhance the immune system. And we think this is going to be really important because the immune system is important to help eradicate tumors. And naturally, your body is always taking care of. Naturally, your body is killing tumor cells really on a daily basis because tumor cells are always being created through mutations and carcinogens and ultraviolet light, and typically these cells are destroyed by your immune system every day. But also, once you get a tumor that learns how to evade the immune system, then it can grow out of control. And then you've got a big problem where you either have to hit it with chemotherapeutic drugs, or in the past couple years, there have been some new drugs that are very targeted and enable the immune system to kill tumor cells. People have probably heard of them. There's one called Keytruda and another one called Opdivo. They're advertised on TV. They really have spectacular results for many patients. Jimmy Carter was a good example. In his 90s, he got treated with Keytruda, and the cancer disappeared.
Wow.
And this happens with a lot of patients. They actually become cancer-free. Some of them have gone for 10, 12 years now. particularly the ones that were involved in the early clinical trials. The unfortunate thing is that only about 20 to 40% of people respond to these drugs. And so our goal is to use cannabinoids to increase this response. And so they'd be used in combination with these drugs, and hopefully they would work real well.
So that leads me to my next question. Do you ever think that the medicines we can create from cannabis, whether they're synthetic or natural, do you think that will take the place of radiation and chemotherapy? As we all know, that I believe some of these patients actually died from that and not the cancer. Do you think that that may be the future?
Well, I think they'll definitely find their place. I think cannabinoids are definitely going to find their place in cancer treatment. Whether or not they'll take things over is a little bit hard to say. Physicians are typically quite conservative when it comes to treating patients. So if there's an established treatment protocol that works for patients, or even for some patients, then that's going to be what they're going to use. And it will only be after extensive trials of new agents or new therapies that's going to be changed, where you can demonstrate that, yeah, this is a new therapy that works better than the old one. So it does take quite a while. And my belief is that cannabinoids are going to find their place, but certainly there's really a lot of good therapies for many types of cancer that are already out there.
Okay, so let's get into cost. As
Sure.
we see, I am very familiar with epileptic children. In fact, when I had my laboratory, we were testing Charlotte's Web, and I got to know a lot of families. And I also know that the only difference that they were doing is taking cannabis. And we have seen the seizures stop completely. We have seen them drastically reduced. And then we come along Epidiolex, and it's how much? Who can afford that? So my question is, I sure hope that we're going to be able to choose either synthetic or whole plant medicine. But a lot of the issues are insurance obviously is not covering cannabis right now. And a lot of patients can barely afford cannabis, let alone synthetically made or Epidiolex. Now, that's another question. Epidiolex, is that synthetically made or is that whole plant?
Actually, Epidiolex is CBD that
Right.
comes from the plant.
Okay.
So GW Pharma makes the product, and they actually isolate it from the plant. And yeah, you mentioned the cost of these drugs, and there's sort of two things. It's the cost of goods for the pharmaceutical company making it, but then it's also the cost to the patient. And yeah, it's a difficult area. When I started in the biotech industry, the biotech and pharma really had a good image, and and I believe that they should. Yeah, I mean, I believe they should. We create drugs that save patients' lives and help out, but now I think we're pretty close to the bottom of that whole scale, and I think a lot of it has to do with drug costs. So yeah, it is real problematic. Specifically with Epidiolex. So this is highly purified CBD. I'm not a spokesman for GW Pharma, but in their clinical trials, they use quite high concentrations of CBD, and they showed just spectacular results. So now that it's approved by the FDA, then insurance companies have to reimburse patients for the use of that drug.
Right.
So
That's a good thing.
yeah, I mean, that's the good thing about it. So I think patients will use it. They should get reimbursed if they've got appropriate coverage. And, you know, it'll be good for GW Pharma, and it'll be great for the patients. So that'll be a good deal.
Yes, and I do this and I've done this, and it's been a very difficult road, as all of us know that have pioneered this regulated industry. But patients first for me, and whatever works for that patient, I'm all for. Of course, I'd rather see whole plant medicine, but I do get that, you know, clinical trials and all of that is extremely expensive, whereas the cannabis manufacturers have had costs, but nothing like those costs. But then we see, you know, like the EpiPen, and how, you know, the CEO is making $17 million and people are dying because they can't get the drug. I think that's, you know, one of the #1 reasons why people are backlashing to pharma. So there should be a give and take, and, you know, human lives, 17 million. I don't know. I don't know how she slept at night, and I'm not sure where that went, but I know there was huge backlash there.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And it really does give pharmaceutical companies a bad name when they're just, you know, out for the profits, and particularly when they gouge in those kind of circumstances where there's a drug that's been on the market for ages, and just because they've kind of cornered the market, they can increase the price astronomically. So yeah, that doesn't make me feel good. I'm certainly with you when it comes to being against that kind of behavior.
Sure. And of course, I also understand that some of these medicines aren't going to be able to be derived from the whole plant. So I do understand that. I'm sure I'll get a lot of backlash on this, but this is fascinating, and I really hope that you come back after we start the human trials and, you know, give us an update. But is there anything else you want to share that, you know, we might not have covered that you want people to know?
Not really off the top of my head. Yeah, I've enjoyed being on your program, and I'm always happy to give people information about the work that Pascal is doing, and you know, also about my thoughts about the plant and the products that are made by it, and how they can potentially help human health.
Absolutely. Well, you can learn more about Pascal at pascalbiosciences.com. And then if you have any questions for Pascal or Dr. Gray, you can email those to cultivate@cannabistech.com. Again, Dr. Gray, thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to the future and finding out what you guys are up to.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Take care.
Bye.